Good afternoon. Thought we'd do something a bit different today, and instead of focusing on the numerous Volvo brochures that I have, I thought we'd look at one of my favourite executive cars from the 1980s through into the early 90s. That being the Renault 25, which is pretty much on the sort of top list of actual favourite cars of my favourite cars of all time. I've always liked the 25. I particularly liked the 25 GTS that my parents once owned, and I've always been a fan of the way it looks, and certainly a fan of the styling. So we're going to start with this particular brochure. Not sure of the exact date on this one. It does cover the turbo model, so it's going to be around 1985 or so. Let's see if there's any sort of copyrights or anything to worry. So, when you open the brochure, you are greeted with the Renault 25 V6 Turbo, which for its time was a very powerful car, developing 182 brake horsepower from just a 2.5 litre V6, which was pretty impressive actually for the time. The 2.7 litre V6 that the car used, which was the Peugeot Renault Volvo V6, only developed 144 brake horsepower, so this car developed quite a bit more than that. Now, looking at the car in profile, it's a very handsome shape, and the design team for the 25 was led by the legendary Robert Opron, who also styled the Citroën SM and the Renault Fuego. In fact, if you look at the 25, you can see evidence certainly of the Fuego in there, and to a lesser extent evidence influences of the Citroën SM as well. I'm not just talking from a mechanical standpoint, and also the fact that apparently the 25 does use a version of the SM's gearbox. I don't know how true that is, but I have heard it mentioned from time to time. And another shot of the rear three quarters of the 25 V6 Turbo, and definitely a very handsome machine. And a very nice brochure as well. Just the photography is very nice, just a lovely brochure. Now we come to one of my favourite parts of the car, and that's the interior. The interior itself was styled by Marcello Gandini, and it really just screams out 1980s excess. But also, it was unbelievably ergonomic. I mean, you had things like the heater controls, those trip computer controls, and everything else, including that remote stereo control for the volume and other functions for the radio, which was pretty much a first with Renault. I don't think there were many other manufacturers at the time that were doing that. But you had all of these controls within easy reach, all the major controls within easy reach. Secondary controls such as the window switches were placed on the door, and you had an unbelievably high specification stereo on certain models with graphic equaliser and radio cassette. You also had more minor controls down in the centre console, including a rather bizarre rear wipe setup, which certainly on the version we had was only for wiping the rear screen. It didn't have any built-in wash function. The car was highly specified for the time as well. You had Bosch ABS and also remote controlled door locking, which was via an infrared system, but something that I only ever remember seeing on Renaults of the era. The Rover had it on the 800 back in 1986, but certainly it was something that was, I think, pioneered by Renault, and you sort of generally only saw on Renaults. So if we have a look at this, we can see the rather nice leather interior of the 25 V6. I think leather was an option on the 25 V6 Turbo, along with air conditioning as well, which I think was another option. does seem to go into a lot about the various technology, certainly focusing on this PLIP system. Optional on GTS, but standard, I guess, on GTX upwards. So, in a nutshell, the early range was TS, GTS, GTX, V6 injection, V6 turbo. And you can see that the 25 GTX V6 and V6 turbo feature optional extra of air conditioning. Engine-wise, you had the 2 litre carburettor unit of the venerable Dovran family in the 2 litre TS and GTS, and for the GTX you had the Dovran 4-cylinder 2.2 litre with fuel injection, and it made for a good sort of halfway house between going for the full out V6 or retaining the economy of a 4-cylinder, because it was still a fairly sort of torquey engine. So we see that there it uses the Renault fuel injection system on the 4 cylinders, certainly. Actually the V6 turbo used it as well. I think the standard V6 used a variation of Bosch K Jetronic. And certainly ABS was available on certain models, particularly the V6 turbo. But I think all models featured electronic ignition and engine management, which was a blessing in disguise, but also a pain in the arse if it went problematic, which it sometimes did. There was a large combined coil / ignition amplifier unit that would sometimes have problems. One thing that they did not seem to do, certainly in the earlier years, was corrode, but as time has moved on and obviously the age of the vehicles has increased, they do sort of tend to corrode on places like, I think front subframe is one area that they tend to go. You also had the range of colours. Now, I remember our 25 was Titan Red, and that seemed to be quite a popular colour at the time. You tended to sort of find around this area that cars would tend to sort of appear in the colours that people advertised them, that the cars were advertised in. So I think Titan Red was one of the colours that, or Titian Red was one of the colours that the car was advertised in. So that seemed to be a colour that a lot of people picked up on. This lagoon colour was particularly nice, and I remember seeing a number of V6 injections in that colour and thinking that they looked very, very fetching in that particular colour. You also had the different type of trims that you could have. Our particular 25 had the blue diagonal cord, which actually was sort of like a grey colour, to be honest with you. It wasn't really blue, it was more sort of grey. And I think the ash striped villa appeared on the turbo. You also had the combination of trims that you could have here. So you could only get GTS and GTX with diagonal cord, but you could get the V6 injection automatic with diagonal cord or lever, and the V6 turbo striped villa as standard or lever. But you could only get the turbo in certain colours, so you could get it in white, black, silver grey, or Titian red. I don't seem to remember very many Titian red turbos floating around, although I think one of the original press photos was in that particular colour. It's interesting that they actually include that in the centre of the brochure rather than just a separate pull-out. So we'll just go through and we can have a look a little bit more at this. Incidentally, the 25 replaced both the Renault 20 and the Renault 30 ranges. So you actually had a car which replaced effectively two separate models previously, made things more sort of uniform. There were some differences though, so a good example is on the 4-cylinder versions you had 4-stud wheels and a simpler front end setup. In fact, you can see how poverty spec the GTS instrument panel was, but even that was still pretty damn good for the day. Loads of warning lights and loads of features that you sort of didn't have on typical cars of the time. On the GTX you did have this rather nifty trip computer, which I think was available on the GTX, I'm not sure, I need to check that. But you also had quite a big thing, this speech voice synthesis warning system from the GTX upwards, which was quite a novel feature for its time. There were a number of manufacturers around the time actually getting on board with this. Austin Rover being one of them, with the Maestro and the Montego. But also you sort of saw a lot of Japanese manufacturers getting in the act as well as regards voice synthesis warning systems. And I think certainly in the US market, General Motors had a few models out there with that particular setup as well. So as you can see on the 25 V6 you've got that more muscular front end setup with the additional lamps. You also have 5-stud alloys and a couple of other features that sort of distinguish it from its 4-cylinder companions. You can see that even for the day, quite pitiful output for that 2.7 litre V6. I mean, this was very quickly outclassed by other vehicles. I mean, certainly the 2.7 litre Rover 827 and Rover Sterling models developing 177 horsepower really sort of gave this a run for its money in the field. I mean, some would say that the 25 was probably the better car to drive. Having driven both, I would tend to agree. Looks wise, I don't know. I think the 25 is more handsome, but the 800 isn't a bad car to look at. I mean, the 800 is quite a handsome machine, but the 25, for me, just has the edge ever so slightly. We've got some more information about the audio equipment available. Rather unusually, the brochure does seem to sort of jump all over the place. It doesn't sort of focus really on sort of one model in particular. It does seem to sort of jump all over as regards what each car has. So it seems to cover sort of all versions of the car, say for sort of audio equipment, for example. So it can get a little confusing to sort of work through it, but you get there. It's not too bad. You can see sort of the information there. So yeah, on the V6 injection you are using Brochure Jetronic, as I thought. I think that changed on later models. And here we go, a little bit of information about the dealer network. Back in the days when Renault actually had quite a large range of cars for sale. It's not so big these days, as they have sort of changed their way of marketing, and certainly their branded products such as Nissan and Dacia seem to have a lot more products, certainly vehicles in certain markets that Renault used to occupy in this country. And there we go, an early brochure for one of my favourite cars. I'd just like to say thank you all very much for watching. If you have enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that like button, and also to consider subscribing for more upcoming fascinating hobbies.